Hi, Misha here. Been covering the fighter aircraft of the Japanese Army's Air Force. Started with the Type 1 Ki-43, codename Oscar, then the Type 2 Ki-44, codename Tojo. Then did the Type 3 Ki-61 Tony. And now it's time to wrap things up with the Type 4 Army fighter, Ki-84, known to the Japanese as Gale, as in a strong wind, and to the Allies as Frank, because I think they were just running out of code names. This was the final and frankly best Japanese Army fighter produced, at least in numbers, in World War II. And it honestly amazes me how many they were able to crank out, considering how late in the war this came to be. Now, the Type 1 and the Type 2 were from Nakajima, but then the Type 3 was from Kawasaki. But with the Type 4, it's a return to Nakajima. And this comes in 1942, when the Army laid out specifications for an official replacement for the Type 1, the Oscar. The Type 2 and the Type 3 had been interceptors, one radial engine powered, the other one liquid cooled inline engine powered. They were more specialized, but this time they needed a new all-around fighter, and it needed to have the maneuverability of the Oscar, but it needed to have armor and better armament, better speed. Basically, it needed to be able to go up against new Western fighters like the P-47, newer variants of the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and of course the P-51, the F4U, and the F6F. So pretty tall order, and Nakajima actually delivered. The first prototype flew in March of 1943, and already by April the first pre-production models were coming off Nakajima's assembly lines, but it would actually be over a year before these came into service because of the war. This was an extremely high performance plane for 1943. It used the HA-45 engine from Nakajima, which was an air-cooled radial engine, but it was supercharged with water injection. Could also be ethanol. And even though it delivered a great deal of horsepower compared to the Ki-43s, it was actually virtually the exact same size, only a little bit bigger. So very compact, very high, very modern engine in this thing, and that was the basis for the design. Otherwise, we have a fuselage that is about 32.5 feet long, so a little bigger, but we have a wingspan of under 37 feet, so a little bit smaller than the Ki-61. And like later planes, this was designed with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor protection for the engine and the other components, and for the pilot, as well as an armored headrest. It also had bulletproof glass in the windscreen. And it was designed initially with two 12.7mm machine guns in the fuselage, but they did up the ammo capacity to 350 rounds per gun, and in the wings they had two 20mm cannon with either 120 or 150 shells per cannon. They could also carry up to two 550-pound bombs, one under each wing, or two drop tanks for extended range. And it had a new metal four-bladed propeller as opposed to the three-blade that we saw in most Japanese planes. And yeah, The second prototype, it got up to 387 miles per hour. And during testing, the maximum altitude was nearly 39,000 feet. Although the plane had best performance, best maneuverability at low and medium altitudes, it still did have a higher maximum altitude than the others. It was very capable for what it was, and was a thorn in the side of the Allies all the way through the end of the war. But it was also a thorn in the side of the Japanese, to be honest. By that I mean, it was one thing to design the plane and test it. But in 1943 and coming into 1944, Japan started to really lack, well, virtually everything. Thanks to the Allied submarines, both British and American, Japan was having a hard time getting high-quality fuel, also high-quality metal and metal alloys. They also were having a hard time getting skilled labor in their factories, as most men had been conscripted. And even if they were able to manufacture a plane with unskilled labor using substandard parts and fueling it with substandard fuel, by 1944, especially after all the aircraft that the Navy and Army lost in 1943, they had a hard time getting skilled pilots to fly these. And that was a problem because while it was a good plane, it had a very high landing speed and could be tricky. And again, the high-performance engine required very precise tolerances with very specific metals to be made properly, and so QC problems cropped up frequently. For example, because of the high landing speed, the landing gear took a lot of stress, and as a result they had trouble with the landing gear collapsing on these planes. So later in the war, sometimes they had to kind of engineer landing gear in one way or another. Nevertheless, they did manage to produce these and produce them in large numbers. They would turn out over 3,500. And they would first see active combat during the Battle for Leyte in late 1944, around November. And once this occurred, they were pretty much sent wherever they were needed. One kind of benefit to Japan at this point in the war, their supply lines were very short. They didn't have to worry about flying planes a long distance because Americans were usually just over the horizon. So they were used to kind of fill the hole in the line, and they were used for dogfighting as well as fighter bombers, and as well as interceptors against B-29s. To that end, the armament would change with certain versions. Like I said, this had the two 50 caliber machine guns in the fuselage and the two 20 caliber cannons in the wings. There would be a variant with 4 20mm cannon, although not made in huge numbers. And there would also be a variant with 2 20mm cannon and 2 30mm cannon. So very heavily armed, although they weren't produced in huge numbers. Not a whole lot to say about their activity in 1945, although they did give the Allies something to be wary of. They were only one of 3 or 4 Japanese planes that really were a threat and really were roughly equal to Allied aircraft at that time, but they were still plagued by quality control and supply shortages, so much so that some later variants replaced some components with wood. Needs must and all that. And while they did continue to crank out the engines, they found them more difficult to build and maintain, and the lower quality fuel used just continued to hamper their performance. To that end, while the Ki-84 was superior to older planes, some pilots and squadrons still preferred the old planes because they were reliable and easier to maintain. So that's one thing to consider. One note, and really about the only note of notes for the fighter bombers, they were used during the defense of Okinawa and then trying to repel the Allies after they had invaded. And on April 15th, a flight of 11 fighter bomber Ki-84s bombed and strafed several American aircraft while still on the ground and were quite successful. They used their low performance maneuverability and speed to their advantage and their heavy cannon, plus again they can each carry a couple of bombs. So they did have some successes, but the war was already lost, frankly. So no matter how many they cranked out, frankly, they didn't have enough pilots for them. And the ones that they had were just not skilled enough to fly a modern machine like this. This would have been a great aircraft for a country that was winning a war. I'm sure if America, in some weird alternate history, was losing the war, we could say the F6F Hellcat or P-51D would have been a great aircraft if America had the resources and material to make them properly, and that can be said for the Ki-84. After the war, and it's pretty famous, but this was one of the few Japanese fighters American designers took an interest in, and when they brought one over to America and filled it up with high-octane fuel and used ethanol to inject the supercharged engines instead of just water, they were able to get it over 420 miles per hour during a test flight. So it definitely had the capability, when properly handled and maintained, to go head-to-head with the most modern Allied piston fighters. But of course the problem there, by 1945, jets were coming into use. You had the Gloucester Meteor in Britain, and of course the Messerschmitt Me-262 in Germany, and the Heinkel 162. And America was starting to field the P-80 Shooting Star. So this was a high-end piston aircraft at a time when jets were coming into vogue, not unlike the F6F Bearcat and a few others. But it was really the last major fighter deployed by the Japanese Army Air Force, the Type 4, and really showed, even at the end, not only their population was still willing to crank out aircraft and materials, but their designers still had a thing or two to surprise the Americans and British with. And it is an interesting aircraft. Like the others I've been doing, this is De Agostini, 1/72 scale diecast, spinning propellers, gear up or down. Oddly, the tail wheel on these is down permanently, and I have to wonder if that has something to do with the problems they were having with the gear collapsing. And these just started coming into the country. Before that, about the only Ki-84s we could get were the Oxford ones. Well, that wraps it up. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you like Japanese aircraft or just history, check out some of my other videos. Why not? Unless you're busy, in which case, don't worry about it. But if you're not, hey, they're there. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.